My name is Nathan Cole. I had been a live-in son-in-law to the Sue family for 3 years. To everyone around me, I was just that limping, useless freeloader. Tonight was Stella Sue's birthday. The living room blazed with lights, guests filled every seat, and music drifted through the air like honey. I wore a faded apron that had been washed so many times the fabric felt like tissue paper. I limped out of the kitchen, carrying a homemade birthday cake I'd spent hours on. Every step, a small battle against the old injury in my knee. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, I heard Margaret Sue's shrill voice pierce through the chatter. "Look at him, everyone. A grown man, hobbling around like an invalid, spending his days cooking and scrubbing floors like a maid. What a disgrace." She laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the music. Stella must have done something terrible in a past life to end up with such a useless husband. Low chuckles rippled through the crowd. Relatives who'd always looked down on me exchanged knowing smirks, their eyes raking over me with undisguised contempt. I didn't raise my head. I set the cake down gently on the table, my movements careful and deliberate, as if I were handling something precious instead of just buttercream and sponge. Stella didn't even glance in my direction. Her makeup was flawless, her dress designer, her posture impeccable. When she spoke, her voice came out cold as a winter draft. "There are too many people tonight. Don't bother sitting at the table. Just stand by and attend to things." 3 years, 1,095 days. Every single morning, I rose before dawn to cook breakfast. Every afternoon, I drove her wherever she needed to go. Every evening, I scrubbed floors, did laundry, and ran errands until my back ached and my hands blistered. They called me names, stepped on me, humiliated me in front of strangers and family alike. And I took it all, every last bit of it. Because I was waiting for the moment to strike. I lowered my gaze and murmured, "Yes." Then I melted into the shadows near the wall, becoming as invisible as a piece of furniture. Stella blew out the candles on her cake. The crowd cheered, glasses clinked, and champagne bubbled over. She accepted everyone's congratulations with practiced grace. But when her eyes swept over me, they held nothing but raw disgust. "Nathan, clear these plates away. You're blocking the view." I bent down to gather the dishes. A sharp spike of pain shot through my old knee injury, and I stumbled, nearly dropping a plate. Someone snickered. A cripple who can't even stand steady. Pathetic. My fingers tightened against the ceramic edge. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. "Not yet. Just a few more minutes, must." Then my phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I slipped it out without anyone noticing, tilting the screen just enough to read the message from my butler. "Ack, young master. Your father instructed, it's time to close the net." Hup. Something in me shifted. 3 years of bowing, scraping, and swallowing my pride. All of it drained out of my bones in a single instant. My hand, still trembling from the pain in my knee, slowly curled into a fist. 3 years. That was long enough. Margaret was still ranting. "After tonight, we should push for a divorce. This family can't afford to keep dragging that dead weight around. A penniless orphan with a limp. What was Stella thinking when she married him?" Stella nodded, her voice flat and decisive. "I was going to wait until after my birthday, but you're right. I'll bring it up with him later. It's time." "Divorce?" I said. My voice wasn't loud, but something in the tone cut through the chatter like a blade. The room fell silent, every head swiveling in my direction. They'd never heard me speak like this before, calm, remote, but carrying a weight that made the air itself feel heavier. Slowly, I lifted my head. The cowed, obsequious expression I'd worn for 3 years was gone. In its place was a face they didn't recognize. Hard, cold, utterly unyielding. My eyes, which they'd laughed at for being dull and timid, now gleamed like frozen steel. "No need to wait," I said. "I agree to the divorce." Stella's face shifted. "Nathan, what are you talking about?" Margaret slammed her palm against the table, rattling the silverware. "How dare you? A freeloader like you, putting on airs with us. I looked at them both, and a faint, mirthless smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Do you really think I cared about marrying into the Sue family? Do you honestly believe Sue Group still belongs to the Sue family? I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. A document projection lit up the wall behind me. Shareholder certificates, transfer agreements, equity percentages. Bold, undeniable, printed in crisp black ink against white paper. Nathan Cole holds 67% of Sue Group shares. He is the largest shareholder and the de facto controlling party. Dead silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Stella's pupils contracted so fast, I could almost see the blood drain from her face. Her entire body began to tremble, her voice cracking like cheap glass. No, that's impossible. Margaret's legs gave out. She collapsed into a chair, her face a mask of ashen horror, her mouth working soundlessly like a landed fish. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the gesture unhurried, almost casual. Then I turned and limped toward the front door, each step measured and deliberate, as if I was marking time on their souls. At the threshold, I paused without looking back. 3 years of servitude, I said, my voice carrying through the frozen room. That repays the favor your family once did mine. From this day forward, Sue Group answers to me. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the screams and sobs that erupted inside. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. I lifted my head and looked up at the stars scattered across the sky, like scattered diamonds. 3 years of hiding. Today, at last, the clouds parted. The moment I closed that door, chaos descended on the Sue household. Stella stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her beautiful party dress suddenly looking like a costume on a puppet. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the terror in her eyes. She stared at the closed door, still unable to reconcile the man who'd just walked out with the sniveling, broken husband she'd bullied for 3 years. Margaret was the first to break. She grabbed Stella's arm so hard, her manicured nails left crescent marks in the skin. Stella, that document, it has to be fake, right? There's no way that crippled pauper owns the majority of Sue Group. Stella's lips moved, but no words came out. She knew better. She'd seen enough corporate paperwork in her life to recognize the letterhead, the embossed stamp, the lawyer's signature. It was all real, all of it. The relatives who'd been sneering moments ago now looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. The ones who'd laughed the loudest were already inching toward the exits, desperate to escape the disaster unfolding around them. George Sue slammed his fist against the dining table, rattling the remnants of the birthday cake. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. My father never breathed a word of this while he was alive. As if summoned by his words, the doorbell chimed. My voice wasn't loud, but something in the tone cut through the chatter like a blade. The room fell silent, every head swiveling in my direction. They'd never heard me speak like this before, calm, remote, but carrying a weight that made the air itself feel heavier. Slowly, I lifted my head. The cowed, obsequious expression I'd worn for 3 years was gone. In its place was a face they didn't recognize. Hard, cold, utterly unyielding. My eyes, which they'd laughed at for being dull and timid, now gleamed like frozen steel. No need to wait, I said. I agree to the divorce. Stella's face shifted. Nathan, what are you talking about? Margaret slammed her palm against the table, rattling the silverware. How dare you? A freeloader like you, putting on airs with us. I looked at them both, and a faint, mirthless smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Do you really think I cared about marrying into the Sue family? Do you honestly believe Sue Group still belongs to the Sue family? I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. A document projection lit up the wall behind me. Shareholder certificates, transfer agreements, equity percentages. Bold, undeniable, printed in crisp black ink against white paper. Nathan Cole holds 67% of Sue Group shares. He is the largest shareholder and the de facto controlling party. Dead silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Stella's pupils contracted so fast, I could almost see the blood drain from her face. Her entire body began to tremble, her voice cracking like cheap glass. No, that's impossible. Margaret's legs gave out. She collapsed into a chair, her face a mask of ashen horror, her mouth working soundlessly like a landed fish. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the gesture unhurried, almost casual. Then I turned and limped toward the front door, each step measured and deliberate, as if I was marking time on their souls. At the threshold, I paused without looking back. 3 years of servitude, I said, my voice carrying through the frozen room. That repays the favor your family once did mine. From this day forward, Sioux Group answers to me. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the screams and sobs that erupted inside. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. I lifted my head and looked up at the stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds. 3 years of hiding. Today, at last, the clouds parted. The moment I closed that door, chaos descended on the Sioux household. Stella stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her beautiful party dress suddenly looking like a costume on a puppet. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the terror in her eyes. She stared at the closed door, still unable to reconcile the man who'd just walked out with the sniveling, broken husband she'd bullied for 3 years. Margaret was the first to break. She grabbed Stella's arm so hard, her manicured nails left crescent marks in the skin. Stella, that document, it has to be fake, right? There's no way that crippled pauper owns the majority of Sioux Group. Stella's lips moved, but no words came out. She knew better. She'd seen enough corporate paperwork in her life to recognize the letterhead, the embossed stamp, the lawyer's signature. It was all real. All of it. The relatives who'd been sneering moments ago now looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. The ones who'd laughed the loudest were already inching toward the exits, desperate to escape the disaster unfolding around them. George Sioux slammed his fist against the dining table, rattling the remnants of the birthday cake. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. My father never breathed a word of this while he was alive. As if summoned by his words, the doorbell chimed. George sat at the head of the table, drenched in nervous sweat, unable to form a single coherent defense. The will was ironclad, the paperwork flawless. There was nothing he could say. Margaret burst into the room, her eyes wild. Everyone! You have to believe me. Nathan Cole is a con artist. He must have tricked my father-in-law somehow. No one listened. Shareholders cared about one thing: money. And right now, Sioux Group's stock was plummeting. By mid-morning, the market capitalization had dropped nearly 30%. If they didn't act fast, they'd all be ruined. Someone call Nathan. Get him in here right now. If he doesn't give us answers, we'll tear this company apart. Stella's hands trembled as she dialed Nathan's number. The line rang for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, his voice came through, flat and dispassionate. Yes? Nathan, the company's falling apart. The shareholders are in an uproar. You need to come in. She softened her tone, adding a note of pleading she'd never used with him before. Nathan laughed. It was a quiet sound, with no humor in it. Why would I care if the company falls apart? Because you're the majority shareholder. Ah, now you remember I'm the majority shareholder. His voice hardened by a degree. Yesterday, at your birthday party, you didn't seem so concerned. Stella's throat closed up. Tears pricked at her eyes again. She had no answer. I don't have time for this, Nathan said coolly. Let them make a scene. When they're done, I'll show up. But not before. The line went dead. Stella stood paralyzed, foam pressed to her ear, surrounded by the chaos of shouting shareholders. Their eyes turned to her, some pitying, some mocking, some furious. Margaret lunged forward, snatched the phone from Stella's hand, and dashed it against the floor. The screen shattered, like Stella's composure. This is all your fault. I told you to divorce him months ago. Now we're going to lose everything, because you couldn't see what was right under your nose. Stella sank to the ground, covering her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. She thought about all the small moments from the past 3 years. Rainy days when Nathan had waited for her with an umbrella, only for her to refuse to walk beside him. Nights when she'd been sick, and he'd sat by her bed until dawn, only for her to call him a jinx. Times when she'd come home exhausted, and he'd quietly brought her a glass of warm water, and she'd told him to get out of her sight. She'd had a king in her hand, and she'd thrown him into the mud. Upstairs in the executive wing, the chaos of the conference room was invisible. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a man stood in silhouette against the skyline. Nathan Cole wore a black suit that fit him like it was poured on. He watched the flurry of activity below, with the cold patience of a predator waiting for its prey to tire itself out. His butler stood behind him, voice low. "Young master, shall I intervene?" Nathan tapped a finger against the glass. "Let them wear themselves out. The louder they scream, the more they'll remember what they've lost." His reflection in the window was cool, detached. "The Sue family owed my father. I intend to collect every last cent." 3 years of lying low. This was only the opening act. By lunchtime, the shareholders in the conference room had exhausted themselves. Voices were hoarse, throats dry, tempers frayed. The stock price was still falling. If they kept fighting, they'd all bleed out. George slumped in his chair, looking 10 years older. Margaret had stopped crying and sat staring blankly at the wall. Stella hadn't moved from her spot on the floor, her face swollen and blotchy. Then the conference room door swung open. Nathan walked in. He wasn't wearing the faded t-shirts and worn-out jeans they'd grown, used to seeing him in. Instead, he was dressed in a custom-tailored black suit that emphasized the broadness of his shoulders and the stillness of his bearing. He walked with his slight limp, but there was nothing weak about it now. It was the measured stride of a man who owned every inch of ground he crossed. The room went dead silent. The shareholder, who'd been shouting loudest, shrank back, suddenly finding his cufflinks fascinating. Nathan didn't look at anyone. He walked straight to the head of the table and pulled out the chair. The same chair George had sat in during the chaos. He settled into it with an unhurried ease, as if he'd been sitting there his whole life. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm and unhurried, but carrying a weight that silenced any remaining murmurs. "Continue. I'm listening." Nobody moved. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Nathan's eyes swept across the table. "No? Good. Then I'll speak." He raised one finger. His butler stepped forward and placed a stack of documents on the table. Share certificates, bank statements, legal affidavits, letters of credit. Each one landed with a soft thump that sounded louder than a gunshot in the silence. "I, Nathan Cole, hold 67% equity in Sue Group, legally, compliantly, irrevocably. As of this moment, I am the controlling owner of Sue Group." The room stayed silent. Nobody dared to challenge the paperwork. One older shareholder cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Cole, we're not disputing your ownership, but the company is in crisis. The stock has tanked, and our liquidity is drying up. At this rate, we won't survive the week." Nathan glanced at him. "I'll handle the funding." He took out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke a single word. "Release." 3 minutes later, the finance director burst through the door, his face pale and his voice shaking. $300 million just hit our accounts. Full funding. Gasps rippled through the room. 300 million. A single phone call. That was more liquidity than Sue Group had seen in its best years. Nathan lifted his eyes again. Suspend trading. Stabilize the stock. All withdrawal requests are rejected. Existing management stays on a 1-month probation. Anyone who causes trouble is terminated, immediately, without severance. Heads nodded frantically. Chairs scraped back as executives scrambled to carry out his orders. The shareholders who'd been demanding blood not 10 minutes ago now nodded deferentially, their anger erased by the sheer force of his authority. Stella watched from the floor. Her heart felt like it had been squeezed in a vice. This was Nathan. Not the man who scrubbed floors and took insults. This was the man who commanded armies with the lift of a finger. Nathan's gaze finally landed on her. There was no heat in it, no tenderness. Just an impartial recognition of an object that needed to be dealt with. The divorce papers are ready. My lawyer will bring them this afternoon. Sign them. I won't repeat myself. Stella's tears started flowing again. Nathan, Don't, he cut her off, his voice flat as stamped steel. 3 years, that's enough. He rose from his chair and walked out. His back was straight, his steps unhurried, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo. Stella pressed her palm to her mouth, trying to muffle the sob that tore out of her chest. She finally understood, with a clarity that burned like acid, that she hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost the only source of light she would ever be offered in this lifetime, and she'd extinguished it herself. Nathan's ascent to power spread through the city in a matter of hours. The Sioux family, once perched at the top of the social hierarchy, had tumbled into the mud. Relatives who'd fawned over them now refused to take their calls. Business partners backed away cautiously. Inside the company, fear and obedience warred with resentment. Stella shut herself in her room. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, barely moved. Her mind replayed every moment with Nathan. The way he'd quietly made her breakfast. The way he'd taken her insults without flinching. The way he'd walked into that conference room and taken control like a king reclaiming his throne. Regret gnawed at her like a living thing, burrowing into her chest and making a nest there. Then the doorbell rang. Vivian Lynn swept into the room, her designer heels clicking against the floor. She looked immaculate, as always, her expression shifting seamlessly into one of compassionate concern. "Stella, darling, I heard everything. That Nathan, what a heartless monster." She sat down beside Stella and took her hand. "But listen to me. You can't just let him walk away like this. He used you. He pretended to be poor so he could exploit your family's status to take over. And now that he has what he wants, he's discarding you like trash." Stella shook her head weakly. "No, it's my fault. I should have..." "You should have what?" Vivian leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's a way to fix this, to make him stay. To make sure you keep your position as Mrs. Cole." Stella looked up. "How?" Vivian smiled. "Tonight, I'll arrange to meet him. You show up, pretend to be drunk. I'll have a photographer ready. We'll get some intimate photos of the two of you together. Once those are out, he won't dare divorce you. Public image matters more than anything to a man like him." Stella hesitated. That's not right." "What's not right is him walking all over you." Vivian's voice hardened. "He made you look foolish. Now it's time to fight back. Unless you want to lose everything?" Stella's resolve crumbled. She nodded. That evening, at a private dining room in an upscale restaurant, Nathan arrived exactly on time. He wore black as usual, and his face betrayed no emotion. He sat across from Vivian and waited. "Just say what you came to say." Vivian poured him a glass of expensive wine, her smile as polished as her nails. "I just wanted to apologize on behalf of Stella. She's been so heartbroken, you know." She kept the wine flowing, but Nathan only touched his glass to his lips, never drinking more than a sip. His eyes were watchful, unblinking. At some point, Vivian excused herself to go to the restroom. While she was out, she texted the photographers waiting outside. Then she returned and subtly slipped something into Stella's drink. Stella arrived, looking dazed. She drank the spiked wine, and within moments her head swam. She leaned heavily against Nathan, slurring her words. "Nathan, I'm sorry. Please don't leave me. Please." The door burst open. Cameras flashed. 3, 4, 5 photographers snapping pictures from every angle. Vivian rushed in, her face split by a triumphant grin. "I've got you now, Nathan. These photos of you and Stella will be all over the internet. If you file for divorce, everyone will know what a scumbag you are." Stella blinked, woozy and confused. She looked at Vivian, then at the cameras, and her foggy brain slowly pieced together what had just happened. She'd been set up. Nathan, however, didn't react. He gently pushed Stella away and stood up, brushing invisible dust from his suit. "Finished?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost bored. "Good." He lifted his hand. A large screen on the wall flickered to life, showing a clear, high-definition recording of everything that had happened in the room. Vivian texting the photographers. Vivian slipping the powder into Stella's drink. Vivian's whispered instructions, crystal clear, every frame. Vivian's face went white. When did you... "From the moment you invited me," Nathan said flatly. "I knew what you were planning." He already had his phone out, dialing. "Police? I'd like to report an attempted blackmail and assault." Vivian collapsed to her knees. "No, please, Mr. Cole, I'm sorry." Nathan didn't look at her. His eyes found Stella's, and his voice was ice. "This is how you wanted to win me back? With a cheap trap? You're worse than I thought." He turned and walked out, without looking back. Stella collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Her last shred of dignity, her last chance at redemption, had been destroyed by her own hands. By morning, Vivian Lynn's scheme was exposed everywhere. On social media, in the papers, on every gossip site that mattered. She was ruined. Her name became synonymous with shame. The Sue family's reputation, already battered, sank even lower. Stella didn't leave her room. She couldn't face the world. She couldn't face herself. At noon, the doorbell rang again. The lawyer stood on the doorstep, 2 copies of the divorce agreement in his hand. "Miss Sue. Mr. Cole instructed me to deliver these. He said the signature must be obtained today." Stella stared at the thin stack of paper. Every word felt like a needle piercing her skin. In the division of assets, Nathan had waived all claim to marital property. He didn't want a single cent from the sus. He was walking away clean. Margaret burst out of her room, grabbed the papers, and tore them into pieces. "No, I won't accept this. He's part of this family. He belongs to us." The lawyer calmly pulled another copy from his briefcase. Mr. Cole anticipated this. He provided 3 copies. "If you don't sign, we'll proceed with a court-ordered divorce." Margaret sank to the floor, her face crumpling into fresh sobs. George sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Sign it, Stella. We owe him that much." Stella raised her head, her eyes red and swollen. "I want to see him one more time. Please." The lawyer shook his head. "Mr. Cole said there's no need. Once the papers are signed, just notify me. He won't set foot in this house again." The words hit Stella like a physical blow. The last thread of hope, the last flicker of a chance, was extinguished. She took the pen. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely hold it. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of insults, 3 years of debt. All of it came down to this one scratch of ink. She signed. And in that moment, something inside her broke. The lawyer took the papers and left. The house fell into a heavy silence. Margaret stopped crying. George turned his back, shoulders shacking almost imperceptibly. Stella clutched the divorce decree to her chest, her tears soaking into the paper, smearing the ink. She finally understood. Nathan hadn't been weak. He'd been patient. He'd endured their cruelty, not because he had to, but because he was repaying a debt. He'd given them chance after chance, and they'd taken his kindness for weakness, his patience for cowardice. They'd pushed him past every line, every limit, until there was nothing left to destroy. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. #, Nathan Cole. Assumes control of Sue Group with USD 1 billion investment. Announces full restructuring. #Nastras. #, former freeloader. Becomes city's newest business titan. #. She stared at the photo on her screen. Nathan stood on the executive floor, dressed in an impeccable suit, his gaze level and commanding. He looked like a man who had conquered an empire, and in a way he had. Stella stared until her eyes burned. She had lost. The marriage, the company, the man, the future. Everything. She'd lost it all. And Nathan had risen, free and clear, to the peak of the world. From now on, they would go their separate ways. But for her, there would be no happiness waiting on the other side. With the divorce agreement finalized, my ties to the Sue family were severed. I went back to the old house to retrieve my personal belongings. A shabby suitcase, a few changes of clothes, and a worn photograph album my father had left me. Nothing else. I didn't want a single thing from the Sue family. Margaret stayed locked in her room, too humiliated to show her face. George sat in the living room, head bowed, wordless. Stella stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes red-rimmed, watching me like she was trying to memorize every detail of my face. 3 years in that house, I'd been treated like a servant, cooking, cleaning, driving, running errands, taking insults with a bowed head and a soft yes. And now that I was leaving, they didn't have the right to ask me to stay. Stella walked down the stairs, her feet dragging. "Nathan, you're really going to just go?" I zipped my suitcase shut and looked at her. What else would I do? Stay and let you keep using me as your punching bag? Your cook? Your crippled joke? She flinched, tears spilling over. I was wrong. I see that now. Can't you give me one more chance? I laughed, a short, humorless sound. One more chance? I gave you 3 years of chances. When you called me worthless, did you think about chances? When you made me kneel to tie your shoes, did you think about chances? When you and your mother stomped my dignity into the dirt, did you think about chances? Each sentence struck her like a blow. She couldn't answer. I picked up my suitcase and limped toward the door, my footsteps echoing on the floor. At the threshold I paused. My father saved Harold Sue's life. The Sue family owed us a life. 3 years of service paid that debt in full. From today, we're strangers. I owe you nothing. I pushed the door open. A black Bentley waited at the curb. My butler hurried forward, took my suitcase, and opened the rear door. I slid into the leather seat, feeling the quiet luxury of the car close around me. Through the window, I saw Stella burst out of the house, running after the vehicle. "Nathan! Nathan, wait!" I didn't look back. The window rolled up, and her voice faded into the distance. The car drove smoothly through the city streets. The Sue family home grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. My butler spoke from the front seat. "Young master, the penthouse is ready. Staff is in place." I nodded, closing my eyes. 3 years of hiding. Finally over. I was no longer a man living on borrowed mercy. I was Nathan Cole, heir to the Cole fortune, majority shareholder of Sue Group. The car pulled into a luxury waterfront building. The gates opened, and I stepped out into a world of marble floors, high ceilings, and sweeping views of the river. Servants lined up in perfect rows, bowing in unison. "Welcome home, young master." This was my home. Not the cramped servants' quarters in the Sue house, but a place built for a man who commanded millions. Inside, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city's glittering skyline. I raised a cup of tea to my lips. 3 years of bowing my head so I could finally lift it high. The world would never see the limping, pathetic son-in-law again. From now on, they would see only the man who held the reins. The next morning, I received an urgent call from the hospital. Harold Sue was dying. His time was measured in hours. I almost said no. The debt was paid, the accounts settled. The Sue family's fate was no longer my concern. But my butler, who had known my father, gently persuaded me. "Young master, Harold Sue had a connection with your father. You should see him one last time." I relented. Outside the VIP ward, Stella, George, and Margaret huddled together. They looked haggard, hollow-eyed, as though the events of the past weeks had aged them a decade. When they saw me, Stella's lips parted, her hand lifting as if to reach for me, then falling back. I walked past them without a word and pushed the door open. Harold Sue lay in the hospital bed, his skin the color of old parchment, his breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the sheets. When he saw me, his eyes flickered with a weak but unmistakable light. He reached out a trembling hand, and I took it. "Nathan, child." His voice was a thread of sound. "Your father, my rescue. It wasn't chance." I raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. The Cole family was too powerful. If I hadn't acted, the Sue family would have been crushed. Your father suggested you come to us, as a son-in-law, partly to repay a debt, partly to position you to take over Sue Group. I had suspected as much. Hearing it confirmed made a strange, bitter sense of completion settle in my chest. "I know. It was unfair." Tears leaked from Harold's eyes. "You suffered. 3 years. My daughter was blind. My wife was cruel. I failed you." "It's over," I said quietly. "No, it isn't over." He squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "I know you're ruthless, but leave them something. They're not evil, just stupid." I didn't agree. I didn't refuse. 3 years of systematic humiliation couldn't be erased by a dying man's apology. Harold's eyes met mine, and a faint, sad smile crossed his face. "Your father chose right. The Cole blood, it's stronger than anything." His hand went slack. The heart monitor let out a long, piercing shriek. I stood by the bed, looking down at the man who'd been both my benefactor and my jailer. I felt no triumph, no sorrow, no anger. Only a great, flat emptiness, where emotion used to be. Behind me, the door burst open. Stella rushed to the bedside, collapsing over her grandfather's body. Margaret and George followed, their cries filling the room. I turned and walked out. In the hallway, Stella's voice cut through the air. "Nathan, grandfather is gone. Can't you at least?" "No," I said, without turning around. "Your grandfather's debt is paid. Yours is just beginning." I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Their sorrow, their regret, their tears, they were none of my concern. My butler waited down the hall. "Back to the office, young master?" I adjusted my cuffs. "Yes, call a board meeting. I'm restructuring management today. And as of this morning, the Sue Group belongs to the Coles." The sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, casting long golden rectangles on the floor. The man who'd limped out of the Sue household had vanished. In his place stood someone who ruled. The Sue Group boardroom was silent. Absolutely, deathly silent. Every old employee, every Sue family loyalist, every manager who'd once mocked Nathan Cole for being a crippled freeloader, now sat rigid in their chairs, barely daring to breathe. 3 days ago, they'd laughed at him. Today, he held their fates in his hands. Nathan sat at the head of the table, one finger tapping a slow rhythm against the polished wood. "We're only going to do one thing today," he said, his voice as calm as a glacier. "A cleanup." His assistant began reading names from a list. Zhong Lei, embezzled company funds, $127,000, dismissed, referred to the authorities. Liu Hao, leaked confidential bids to competitors, causing the loss of a $300 million contract, dismissed, permanently blacklisted. George Sue, negligent management, repeated decision-making failures, removed from all positions, stripped of company affiliation. Each name landed like a hammer blow. Faces went pale, hands trembled. When George's name was read, he shot to his feet. "Nathan, I'm Stella's father. You can't do this to me." Nathan looked up. His eyes were cold as Arctic waters. 3 years I lived in your house. You barely acknowledged my existence. When I was humiliated, you said nothing. When the company started bleeding money, you did nothing. Now you want to talk about family ties? George opened his mouth, but no words came. He sank back into his chair, defeated. Margaret, who tried to sneak into the meeting through a side door, was intercepted by security. She screamed and struggled. but they escorted her out without ceremony. Nathan ignored the commotion. For those who remain, you either follow the new rules or you leave today. Your salary will be settled and you're free to go. No hard feelings. There was a long pause. Then, as one, the remaining managers and executives stood. We'll stay, Mr. Cole. We'll follow your leadership. No one was foolish enough to leave. Nathan had injected $1 billion into the company, stabilized the stock, and opened new revenue streams. Sue Group was poised for explosive growth. Anyone who left now was throwing away a fortune. Nathan nodded. Good. From today, all management positions will be merit-based. Promotions will go to the capable, demotions to the incompetent. Financial transparency will be the rule, not the exception. Anyone who underperforms for 3 consecutive months will be asked to leave. The meeting ended in less than an hour. The bloated, inefficient Sue Group had been radically restructured. The Sue family's influence was uprooted entirely. Stella, who'd been hiding in the stairwell, listened to everything. She felt a curious numbness rather than anger. Nathan hadn't been cruel or vindictive. He'd been fair. Ruthlessly, clinically fair. The company was stronger than it had ever been. And that was what hurt the most. She knocked on Nathan's office door. His voice came through, flat and professional. Enter. She stepped in. He was sitting behind his desk, reviewing documents, not looking up. What is it? Nathan, she said softly. I just want to say, thank you, for saving the company. That's all. He finally lifted his gaze. I'm not saving the company. I'm taking what's mine. Stella felt her chest tighten. I know I have no right to ask anything. I wanted you to know I regret everything. Nathan was silent for a moment. Then he said, too late. One word. It severed everything. Stella turned and walked out, tears blurring her vision. The door clicked shut behind her. Nathan set down his pen and looked out the window. The city sprawled beneath him, glittering with promise. He sent a message to his assistant. Proceed with the new project. Schedule a press conference next week to announce the full restructuring. From now on, Sue Group was reborn, and he was its sole master. 3 months later, the Sue Group restructuring press conference was packed. Journalists from every major outlet had crowded into the ballroom. Cameras blinked, lights blazed. The company that had once been on the brink of bankruptcy was now the most talked about success story in the city. I stood at the podium, dressed in a black custom suit. My limp was still there, it always would be, but no one dared to mock it anymore. In fact, it gave my presence a kind of gravitas, a reminder that I'd walked through fire to get here. The applause was thunderous. 3 months of hard reforms, aggressive investments, and strategic pivots had transformed Sue Group beyond recognition. Revenues had doubled. Morale was sky high. The board that had once tried to overthrow me now sat in the front row, nodding with approval. The media had their headlines ready. As #former crippled freeloader becomes city's business titan, as #Nathan Cole. 3 years of patience, now the world at his feet, I gave a brief speech, measured and unemotional. Sue Group will continue to move forward. We won't let those who trusted us down. After my closing remarks, the journalists surged forward like a tide. Mr. Cole, what was the most important lesson from your 3 years of hiding your identity? Mr. Cole, is there any lingering affection for the Sue family? Mr. Cole, would you consider remarrying? I raised a hand, and silence fell. 3 years of patience were 3 years of purpose. Debts have been paid, accounts are settled, and the Sue family and I are no longer connected. As for my personal life, that remains private. I walked off the stage without answering any follow-ups. I left no loose ends, no hints for gossip columnists to dissect. At the back of the room, Stella stood in the shadows watching. She had lost weight. There were faint shadows under her eyes. but something in her expression had changed. There was a quietness now, a stillness that hadn't been there before. Since the restructuring, she'd taken a position as a low-level staff member, working hard without complaint. As I passed by, she didn't approach. She simply gave a small bow and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Cole." I nodded in acknowledgement. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "I'll work hard from now on. I won't bother you again. I wish you every success." I murmured a brief acknowledgement and walked past her. I felt no hatred, no resentment, no lingering attachment. It was simply over. 3 years of humiliation, 3 years of patience, 3 years of climbing out of the abyss. And at the end of it, all that remained was two strangers passing each other in a crowded room. I slid into the Bentley. My butler handed me a cup of tea. "Everything is in order, young master." I looked out the window at the city lights. This city, which had once been a cage, now lay beneath my feet. My phone buzzed, a message from one of my father's old associates. "The Cole family's entire business network is ready for you. You can return to your full inheritance anytime." I typed back, "Let it wait. I want to bring Sue Group to the very top first." Then I closed my eyes. The world knew only the glory of my sudden rise. They didn't see the 3 years I'd spent on my knees by a stove, swallowing insults with every meal. They praised my reversal of fortune, but they didn't know the weight of every hobbled step I'd taken through the mud. But I didn't regret any of it. To endure what others cannot endure, that was the cost of achieving what others cannot achieve. The Bentley glided into the underground garage of my penthouse. Servants lined up, bowing. "Welcome home, young master." I walked into the living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the entire city skyline. I poured myself a glass of wine and swirled it, watching the ruby liquid catch the light. 3 years ago, I was a nobody, a limping, humiliated son-in-law, owned by a family that despised me. 3 years later, I controlled billions, commanded armies of employees, and answered to no one. I touched the rim of my glass to the window, as if tossing the city below. 3 years, worth every second. The glass settled on the table. From this moment on, the world would remember only one name: Nathan Cole. Not the crippled son-in-law, not the pitiful servant, but a man who had rewritten his own fate with patience, grit, and a will of iron. The road ahead stretched out, bright and boundless. My legend had only just begun. 6 months had passed since the restructuring press conference. Sue Group, no, it was already being called Cole Group in the financial press, had become a juggernaut. Quarterly earnings had tripled. New partnerships with European conglomerates had opened doors that had been sealed for decades. My face appeared on magazine covers. My name whispered in boardrooms across the country. But success attracts vultures. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning, when my assistant placed a thin dossier on my desk. "Eric Chen," she said, her voice tight with concern. "He's been quietly acquiring shares through shell companies. As of yesterday, he holds 12%. I opened the file. Eric Chen, 42, graduate of Wharton, founder of a private equity firm known for hostile takeovers. He had a reputation for gutting companies, stripping their assets, and leaving carcasses behind. His smile in the photograph was wide and carnivorous. He's been courting the remaining Sue family loyalists," my assistant continued. "The ones you didn't fire. Some of them are still bitter. Chen is promising them their old positions back if he gains control." I closed the file. "Let him buy. Every share he acquires drives the price up. When he thinks he's close to a controlling stake, we'll release our counteroffer." I had anticipated this. The Cole family's hidden reserves were vast, more than enough to buy back every share Chen could scrape together. But I wanted to see his play first. I wanted to watch him commit, to burn his capital, to believe he was winning. Over the next few weeks, Eric Chen's moves became bolder. He appeared on financial news channels, dropping hints about reinvigorating, stagnating companies. He held private dinners with dissident shareholders. his laughter loud and confident. The media began speculating about a hostile takeover, painting me as the former underdog who might lose everything again. I let them talk. Stella, now a mid-level manager in the logistics division, heard the rumors like everyone else. She came to my office one evening, after the rest of the building had emptied. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Nathan, I know I have no right to ask you anything, but Eric Chen approached me last week. He offered me a seat on his board if I'd help him destabilize the company from the inside." I looked at her, genuinely curious. "And what did you tell him?" I told him no. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either if I were you. But I've spent the last 6 months rebuilding myself from nothing. I'm not the woman who let her mother spit on you. I'm not going to be anyone's pawn again." She met my eyes for the first time without flinching. There was a new solidity in her posture, a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. I nodded slowly. "If Chen contacts you again, let me know. That's all I ask." She nodded, turned, and walked out. I watched her go, noticing that she didn't linger, didn't plead, didn't apologize again. She had finally learned to stand on her own. The following week, Eric Chen made his move. At an emergency shareholders meeting he'd called, with enough votes to demand it, he strode into the boardroom like a conquering general. He wore a tailored Italian suit, his hair slicked back, his teeth gleaming. Behind him stood a phalanx of lawyers and analysts. "Nathan Cole," he said, spreading his arms wide. "The little boy who played beggar for 3 years. Congratulations on your rise. But every empire has its limit, and yours has reached its ceiling." He projected charts and graphs onto the wall, showing his accumulated shares and the list of shareholders who'd pledged to support him. "With the proxies I've collected, I'm prepared to call for a vote of no confidence in your management. And given your unorthodox rise to power, I think the board will agree that a change is in order." The room murmured. Some of the older shareholders, the ones I hadn't purged, shifted uneasily in their seats. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. "Eric, you've done your homework. I admire that. But you've made one miscalculation." I signaled to my assistant. She tapped her tablet, and a new set of figures appeared on the screen. "While you were buying those shares at inflated prices, I was buying the debts of your holding company. Every shell you used, every loan you took out to fund this little adventure, I own the notes on all of them. As of 10 minutes ago, I have the right to call in your total debt, which exceeds your entire liquid assets." Eric's smile faltered. He looked at his lawyers, but they were staring at the screen with frozen expressions. "Here's my offer," I continued. "You walk away today. You sell me your 12% at the original purchase price, not the market price, not the inflated price you paid, but the baseline. You take your losses, you lick your wounds, and you never set foot in my company again. In return, I won't foreclose on your debts and destroy your firm." The room was silent. You could hear the hum of the projector. Eric's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to winning, and the realization that he'd been outmaneuvered was visibly painful. But he was also smart enough to know when retreat was the only option. "You'll hear from my lawyers," he said, his voice clipped. He gathered his papers and strode out, his entourage trailing behind him like sheep. The shareholders who'd been wavering quickly reaffirmed their loyalty. I didn't need to threaten them. The outcome spoke for itself. After the meeting, I stood by the window and watched Eric Chen's car peel out of the parking lot. He'd underestimated me. A common mistake. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Impressive. You have your father's instincts. We should talk." I stared at the screen. No signature. But the sender knew about my father. I typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "Someone who's been watching you longer than you think. Dinner tonight at the Riverside, 8 o'clock. Come alone." Enough. I felt a flicker of cold curiosity. I hadn't felt that in months. That evening, I walked into the Riverside, an exclusive private dining club, hidden in an old mansion near the river. The metred led me to a secluded corner table, where a woman sat waiting. She was elegant, silver-haired, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a navy suit that cost more than most people's cars. When she smiled, it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Nathan. I'm Amelia Fox. Your father and I were partners once." She extended a hand. Her grip was firm, assessing. "He told me you'd be extraordinary." He was right. I sat down, my guard up, but my curiosity peaked. "What do you want?" "Straight to business. I like that." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Eric Chen was a pawn. Someone bigger sent him. Someone who wants to see the Cole family finish what it started, then fall. But someone is my enemy too. I propose we join forces." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Accounts, transfers, and names that reached into the highest circles of power. "Your father was killed," she said quietly. "Not in an accident. He was murdered because he was about to expose a network of corruption that reaches the top of this city. You've inherited his battle, Nathan, whether you like it or not." I looked at the names on the page. One of them was familiar. A board member of Sioux Group I'd never fully trusted. Another was a politician I'd seen on television. The game had just gotten infinitely larger. I closed the folder and met Amelia Fox's gaze. "Tell me everything." She smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. "I was hoping you'd say that." The information Amelia gave me over the following weeks changed everything. My father's death had been staged as a car accident, but it was no accident. He'd been investigating a money laundering ring that used legitimate businesses as fronts, including Harold Sue's old associates. The ring stretched across borders, involving banks, law firms, and even government officials. Harold Sue had known about it. That was why he'd protected my father's inheritance and maneuvered me into position. He wasn't just repaying a debt. He was hiding me in plain sight, waiting for me to be strong enough to continue the fight. I spent sleepless nights reviewing documents, cross-referencing accounts, building a case that would stand up in court. Amelia provided resources, investigators, forensic accountants, security experts. Her own vendetta against the ring ran deep. They'd killed her brother 15 years ago. Stella, unaware of the shadow war I was fighting, continued her steady climb within the company. She'd become a respected figure in the logistics division, known for her meticulous work and refusal to play office politics. Margaret and George had faded into quiet obscurity, living off a modest allowance I'd approved out of pragmatism rather than mercy. One evening, Stella caught me in the hallway, my briefcase stuffed with classified documents. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the tension in my shoulders. "Something's happening, isn't it?" she said. "You're not just running the company anymore." I hesitated. She'd proven herself reliable, but trust was a scarce commodity. "It's complicated," I said. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "I'm not the same person I was, Nathan. I know you don't owe me anything. But if you need someone who knows the old Sioux family connections, the backdoor deals, the quiet favors, the people who whispered in my grandfather's ear, I can help. I've been keeping a journal, for months, of everything I remember." She pulled a small notebook from her bag. It was worn, filled with cramped handwriting. I didn't know what I was writing for. Maybe just to purge the guilt. But if it helps you, take it. I took the notebook, flipping through it. Names, dates, amounts, meetings, details that corroborated Amelia's intelligence. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. She met my eyes squarely. "Because I spent 3 years destroying a man who never deserved it. I can't undo that. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to be someone who's worth the air she breathes." There was no pleading in her voice, no expectation of forgiveness, just a quiet, determined truth. I pocketed the notebook. "Thank you." That was all I gave her, but she smiled, a small, broken smile, and walked away. The next month was a blur of legal filings, secure calls, and late-night strategy meetings. Amelia and I coordinated with federal authorities, providing evidence that would convict 15 people. The ring's leadership tried to fight back. There were threats, bribery attempts, even a car that followed me for 3 days before my security team intercepted it. But I'd spent 3 years learning patience. I didn't flinch. On the day the arrests were made, I watched the news from my penthouse. The politician, the board member, the bankers, all taken into custody. The city's elite, exposed and humiliated. My father's name would be cleared posthumously, his reputation restored. Amelia called me that evening. "It's done, Nathan. Your father would be proud." I stood at the window, looking out at the river glittering under the moonlight. He wouldn't be proud. He'd just be relieved it's over. "Perhaps," she paused. "You know, he always said you were his greatest achievement. Not the business, not the money. You." I didn't answer. The words lodged somewhere in my chest, warm and painful. The next morning, I walked into the office and announced the company's official renaming. No more Sue Group. From now on, it was Cole Holdings. The sign above the entrance would be replaced. The brand would be reborn. There was no resistance. The old guard was gone. The new team, people I'd hired for talent, not loyalty, applauded the change. Stella was in the front row. She clapped with everyone else, her face calm. When the meeting ended, she came up to me. "I'm glad," she said. "It's time to stop being defined by the past." I nodded. "You've done good work, Stella. Keep it up." She held my gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod and walked away. There was no longing in her steps, no desperation. Just the stride of a woman who had finally found her own path. Later that week, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and violet. The city below hummed with life, indifferent to the wars that had been won and lost in its shadows. My phone buzzed, a message from Amelia. "The last of the ring's assets are being liquidated. Your father's legacy is secure. What's next for you?" I typed back. "I'm going to build something that lasts. Something my father would have believed in." I pocketed the phone and looked out at the horizon. 3 years of hiding, a year of fighting, and now, finally, a future that belonged entirely to me. The limping cripple, the humiliated son-in-law, the boy who'd learned to wait. All of them had been tools I used to sharpen myself. Now I was whole. Now I was free. I raised my glass to the fading light and smiled. The legend wasn't finished. It had only just found its true purpose. Epilogue. The road ahead, Ponce. 1 year later, Cole Holdings had become a multinational powerhouse. Our portfolio spanned technology, logistics, and sustainable energy. My face no longer appeared on gossip magazines. I'd stopped giving interviews. But my name was spoken with respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. Stella had risen to vice president of operations. She'd found a new partner, a quiet engineer who had no idea about her past. She was happy. I saw her occasionally at company events, and we exchanged polite nods. The old wounds had healed into faint scars, barely visible. Margaret and George had moved to a small town by the coast, living modestly on the allowance I'd arranged. They'd stopped complaining. I heard Margaret had taken up gardening, and George volunteered at a local library. They had become, improbably, ordinary people. As for me, I'd found a different kind of peace. I ran my company with integrity and ambition, but I never forgot the years I'd spent on my knees. They kept me humble. They kept me sharp. On the anniversary of my father's death, I visited his grave. The headstone was simple, the grass trimmed. I knelt and placed a white rose on the stone. "I finished what you started," I said quietly. "You can rest now." The wind stirred the leaves above me. I stood, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked back to the car. Inside, my assistant handed me a tablet. "New project proposals, sir. The Clean Energy Initiative in Southeast Asia. They're ready for final approval." I scrolled through the document, making notes. Work was work, but it was work that mattered. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the cemetery receding in the window. I thought of all the people who'd shaped my life. The ones who'd humiliated me. The ones who'd betrayed me. The ones who'd helped me rise. They were all part of the same story. And that story, I knew, was still being written. I smiled, settled back into the leather seat, and turned my attention to the future. The limp was still there. Always would be. But it had become a mark of survival, not shame. From nowhere to everywhere. From nothing to everything. My name is Nathan Cole, and I'm just getting started.